river. Here, as at Hong Kong and Calcutta, were mixed crowds of all races. Americans and English, Chinamen and Dutchmen, mostly merchants ready to buy or sell anything. The Frenchman felt himself as much alone among them as he had dropped down in the midst of Hottentots. He had at least one resource to call on the French and English consuls at Yokohama for assistance, but he shrank from telling the story of his adventures, intimately connected as it was with that of his master, and, before doing so, he determined to exhaust all other means of aid, as chance did not favor him in the European quarter. He penetrated that inhabited by the native Japanese, determined, if necessary, to push on to Yedo. The Japanese quarter of Yokohama is called Benten, after the goddess of the sea who is worshipped on the islands round about. There Passepartout beheld beautiful fir and cedar groves, sacred gates of singular architecture, bridges half hid in the midst of bamboos and reeds, temples shaded by immense cedar trees, holy treats which were sheltered Buddhist priests and sectaries of Confucius, and interminable streets where a perfect harvest of rose-tinted and red-cheeked children, who looked as if they had been cut out of Japanese screens, and who were playing in the midst of short-legged poodles and yellowish cats, might have been gathered. The streets were crowded with people. Priests were passing in processions, beating their dreary tambourines. Police and custom-house officers with pointed hats encrusted with lac and carrying 2 sabres hung at their waists. Soldiers, clad in blue cotton with white stripes and bearing guns. The Mikado's guards, enveloped in silken doublets, habkirks, and coats of mail. And numbers of military folk of all ranks, for the military profession is much respected in Japan as it is despised in China, went hither and thither in groups and pairs. Passepartout saw 2 begging friars, long-robed pilgrims, and simple civilians, with their warped and jet-black hair, big heads, long busts, slender legs, short stature, and complexions varying from copper color to a dead white, but never yellow like the Chinese, from whom the Japanese widely differ, and did not fail to observe the curious equipages, characters, palanquins, barrows supplied with sails, and litters made of bamboo, nor the women, whom he thought not especially handsome, who took little steps with their little feet, whereon they wore canvas shoes, straw sandals, and clogs of worked wood, and who displayed tight-looking eyes, flat chests, teeth fashionably blackened, and gowns crossed with silken scarves, tied into an enormous knot behind an ornament which the modern Parisian ladies seem to have borrowed from the dames of Japan. Passepartout wandered for several hours in the midst of this motley crowd, looking in at the windows of the rich and curious shops, the jewelry establishments glittering with quaint Japanese ornaments, the restaurants decked with streamers and banners, and the tea-houses where the odorous beverage was being drunk with sake, a liquor concocted with the fermentation of rice, and the comfortable smoking-houses where they were puffing not opium, which is almost unknown in Japan, but a very fine, stringy tobacco. He went on till he found himself in the fields, in the midst of the vast rice plantations, where he saw dazzling camellias expanding themselves with flowers which were giving forth the last colours and perfumes, not on bushes but on trees, and within bamboo enclosures, cherry, plum, and apple trees, which the Japanese cultivate rather for their blossoms than their fruit, and were queerly fashioned grinning scarecrows protected from the sparrows, pigeons, ravens, and other voracious birds. And on the branches of the cedars were perched large eagles. Amid the foliage of the weeping willows were herons, solemnly standing on one leg. On every hand were crows, ducks, hawks, wild birds, and a multitude of cranes, which the Japanese considered sacred, and which to their minds symbolized long life and prosperity. As he was strolling along, Passepartout espied some violets among the shrubs. "Good," said he, "I'll have some supper." But on smelling them, he found that they were odorless. No chance there, thought he. The worthy fellow had certainly taken good care to eat a hearty breakfast as possible before leaving the Carnatic, but, as he had been walking about all day, the demands of hunger were becoming importunate. He observed that the butcher's stalls contained neither mutton, goat, nor pork, and knowing also that it is sacrilege to kill cattle, which are preserved solely for farming, he made up his mind that meat was far from plentiful in Yokohama. Nor was he mistaken, and in default of butcher's meat, he would have wished for a quarter of wild boar or deer, or partridge, or some quails, or some game or fish, with which rice the Japanese eat almost exclusively. But he found it necessary to keep up a stout heart, and to postpone the meal he craved till the following morning. Night came, and Passepartout re-entered the native quarter, where he wandered through the streets, lit by vari-coloured lanterns, looking on at the dancers, who were executing skilful steps and boundings, and the astrologers who stood in the open air with their telescopes. Then he came to the harbour, which was lit up by the resin torches of the fishermen who were fishing from their boats. The streets at last became quiet, and the patrol, the officers of which, in their splendid costumes, surrounded by their suites, Passepartout thought seemed like ambassadors succeeding the bustling crowd. Each time a company passed, Passepartout chuckled and said to himself, "Good, another Japanese embassy departing for Europe." End of chapter 22. Read by David Russell. For Lit to Go. Available on the web at fcit.usf.edu.